We have a lot to talk about, and we begin with the news that Jacob Trouba has been traded by the New York Rangers to the Anaheim Ducks, plus Igor Shesterkin signs an 8-year extension with the New York Rangers.
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blueshirts fans, to episode number 1197 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, wow, 2 bombshells in one day. We have the news this morning that the Rangers are going to be parting ways with Jacob Trouba in one way or another. And then, of course, they end up trading him to the Ducks. And then a little bit later in the day, the news that the long-awaited extension between the Rangers and Igor Shesterkin has been finalized. Igor gets 8 years, which is the maximum at $11.5 million. So a slight uptick in what the Rangers offered him this preseason, 8 years, $11 million. Good news that obviously the franchise goalie and proven playoff performer Igor Shesterkin is under contract. But here's how this is going to work here today. So again, 2 bombshells in one day. Absolutely crazy stuff here. The 2 biggest stories in the NHL on this day by far. And then, of course, the Rangers are going to be playing the Penguins a little bit later tonight as well. So here's how we're going to handle this. Today's going to be all about Jacob Trouba. The next episode, we'll focus more on Igor Shesterkin and his extension. And then, of course, whatever happens between the Rangers and the Penguins. But there was so much drama with Jacob Trouba, really dating all the way back to the offseason, the summer, when it looked like he might be heading to Detroit. There was going to be a little bit of salary retention on the part of the New York Rangers. But obviously that never happened. You know, free agency came and went. That's going to be important. We're going to talk about that aspect of it a little bit later. I'm going to discuss specifically the worst part of this entire Jacob Trouba saga, and it does have to do with how everything went down this summer. That will make sense in a little bit. But, yeah, I mean, as far as what happened today, it felt like this was a long time coming. Jacob Trouba's play has just slipped and slipped and slipped, and obviously the Rangers are off to, they got off to a decent start this season, but, you know, more recently they've been really nothing short of terrible. I mean, let's be honest, they've lost 6 out of their last 7, and just as sure as we can praise the leaders on this team when the things are going well for the Rangers and, you know, talk about the leadership from this guy and that guy, when the team looks as flat and as lifeless for as long of a period as this Ranger team has looked flat and lifeless, again, losing 6 of their last 7, and really, I mean, even the only win, they barely squeaked by the Montreal Canadiens, then yes, a lot of the heat is going to come down on the leadership group, the veterans, and certainly the captain, to be the most specific. Now, obviously, we can't say that this is all on Jacob Trouba. There's a lot of Rangers on this team right now that are not exactly pulling their weight, are not exactly living up to the contracts that they have signed. However, with Jacob Trouba, this has been a very steady decline over the last handful of seasons here. I would say probably the 2 preceding seasons before this year, and then, of course, this season as well. Jacob Trouba in that time has just basically been going down and down and down. You know, you look at his play on the ice this year, and it just hasn't been pretty. I mean, you can use any metric you want to use. You can use any eye test you want to use. Gets caught out of position a lot of turnovers, way too many turnovers for Jacob Trouba. Struggles badly against the rush, just doesn't seem to be able to defend it. His lack of speed has really been getting exposed. We saw that specifically in the playoffs. His play in general in the playoffs the last couple seasons, and certainly last year when, no exaggeration, there were games where Jacob Trouba single-handedly lost for this team in the postseason last year, and I think he was exposed at that time. His offensive skills have basically evaporated. You know, that they've been on a steady decline as well. Even his physicality, which this is something that I think a lot of Ranger fans, and specifically Trouba supporters, because he does have his fans, there's no doubt about that. That's one thing that they could always point to. And like, you know what? This guy's tough as nails. He's gritty. He gets in your face. He'll hit all this stuff. We haven't even really seen any of that this season. And that's been something that I think has been about as disappointing as anything else. And like I said, just the eye test. I mean, this guy is just not playing good hockey. And to kind of build on that and really build on everything I just said, one of the biggest indictments I think of Jacob Trouba so far this season, and this dates back to last season as well. The Raiders have been juggling their defense pairings, right? They're trying to find the secret sauce, the right formula, whatever you want to call it. They're trying to figure out which defenseman should be playing with which other defense. And they've mixed up their defense pairings at the start of this season more often than I can remember them, certainly at any point in recent Ranger history. There will be the occasional tweak every once in a while, but they've had everybody playing with everybody. And it seems like it's being done, at least in part, to figure out who Jacob Trouba is compatible with. And I don't know what the answer to that question is because they tried everybody and it really doesn't work. And like I said, I think the biggest indictment, or one of the biggest indictments on Trouba, is that whichever defenseman plays with him, it feels like he drags them right down with him. Like it's not, he's not doing it on purpose, obviously. But Jacob Trouba has been such a liability this season that it feels like whichever defenseman is out there with him, he's up against it as well. And doing all these episodes, and obviously, we go through the whole offseason, we go through the whole regular season, hopefully the postseason this season. I mean, that's a whole nother story in and of itself. We will see. But, there's times over the last calendar year or so where I've been critical of Jacob Trouba, and there will be Trouba supporters that come out and they say to me like, hey man, you're being tough on Trouba. What about Keandre Miller? He hasn't been good this season. What about Ryan Lindgren? He hasn't been good this season either. You're absolutely right. Neither one of them has played well at all. But in my defense, the episode before this one was me talking about Keandre Miller looking for a big contract extension and me explaining why I don't think that should happen. Ryan Lindgren, you guys know, the everydayers know this has been one of my favorite players pretty much ever since he's gotten here. He hasn't been any good this season. I mean, that's just the bottom line. He's played very poorly. Most of the Ranger defensemen have. Even Adam Fox, I feel like watching him on a night out basis, he's not hurting the Rangers the way that some other players are, but he doesn't exactly look like a Norris Trophy candidate, which is what we expect him to be. But all this is to say that the reason why maybe I target Trouba a little bit more than the other guys, and there's actually a couple of reasons, but one of them is that, you compare him again to Lindgren, to Miller. Neither one of those two are the captain of the New York Rangers, and neither one of those two are making $8 million per season. Jacob Trouba comes over here, signs the 7-year extension, $8 million. I mean, I'm expecting elite level play. I see him every once in a while back when he was on the Winnipeg Jets, but I don't know a ton about this guy. He's in the Western Conference. They're on late at night, and, he comes over to the Rangers, and this guy must be an absolute beast. And, there's times where obviously he has played well, but the bottom line is this is somebody that's supposed to be your captain. This is somebody that's supposed to be one of your elite players, and he's just not even close to that. Now, I will say in Trouba's defense, I thought he got off to a decent start this season. Not a phenomenal start or anything like that, but he got to the point where he was at least playing serviceable hockey. You go back to the first 5 or 6 games of the season, they had him on a pairing with Braden Schneider. It seemed to work. Keandre Miller was up with Adam Fox while Ryan Lindgren was hurt, so that opened up the door for Trouba to play with Schneider. I thought they did all right together. I thought Trouba at least held his own. After that, though, it basically fell off a cliff. And mind you, when that happened, when Trouba was with Schneider early in the season, the Rangers started the season 5-0-1, which feels like a lifetime ago. But I think when you're winning that frequently, it does kind of mask some of the problems that maybe you have. And, again, I think Trouba did okay, but I don't think his play was anything special at that time either. And it's only fallen off since then. And something else that I always go back to when it comes to Jacob Trouba, and again, Trouba has his fans. He absolutely has his fans. And if you're hurting today, if you're upset that this happened, if Trouba's your favorite player, my heart goes out to you. I feel for you. We all get attached to this player for that player. It's part of being a hockey fan. It's part of being a sports fan. But even the biggest Trouba fan, even the staunchest Jacob Trouba defender out there listening to this, watching this, whatever it might be, you cannot tell me, and this is a point that I made after the playoffs last year, once the Rangers got knocked out by the Panthers, you cannot tell me that you look at this guy and you see the way he plays hockey and you see how he performs on a night in and night out basis, and you come to the conclusion that this guy is worth $8 million per season. There's just no way. And I hate to always go down that road where I'm always kind of, associating every single player with, well, how much money does he make? But that we all do that because that's part of, sports, and that's part of being a hockey fan. And especially being in the NHL, more so than the other sports, this is a sport where the salary cap is a lot tighter than other sports. Baseball, there is no salary cap. So go out and buy whoever you want. The Los Angeles Dodgers know a couple of things about that. That's for sure. But in this sport, the salary cap is very tight. You have to make every single dollar count. And when you're going into year what is this with Trouba? Like year 5 with Jacob Trouba? Are we up to 6, whatever it is? Shelling out $8 million for this guy to give you the kind of hockey that he's giving you, that's just not good business at a certain point. And I am amazed that not only did Chris Drury and the Ranger brass trade him without having to have any salary retention whatsoever, but they actually also received a former first-round pick defenseman as well as a 4th-round pick for next season. The fact that they got anything for Jacob Trouba, did not have to attach a sweetener, did not have to retain any salary. That's awesome work by the Ranger brass, by Chris Drury there. And look, Chris Drury's not blameless either. I think, like Jacob Trouba was saying, like other Rangers seemingly feel, I think there's aspects of this that could have been held better, could have been handled better, excuse me. But, this is the cold hard business of sports. This is the way it goes. And when you're a professional athlete, these things can happen. You can get traded, and it is unfortunate, especially if you have a young family like Jacob Trouba does. And anytime something like this happens, certain people, myself included, will say, well, that's part of the business. That's part of what you sign up for when you become a professional athlete. These things can happen. You can get waived. You can get released. You can get traded, whatever the situation might be, and you just have to roll with the punches and keep going. And then there will always be a couple of people that say, well, maybe it shouldn't be that way. I'm sorry, what are we talking about here? And I'm not even trying to be snarky about this or anything. I'm genuinely asking the people that feel that way to explain the alternative, because if there is one, I don't see it. Do you want to just outlaw trading? That's not going to happen, nor should that happen. I don't think there's anybody that wants that to happen. So I don't think there is any good answer. And I do feel for Jacob Trouba to an extent. I feel like it's pretty obvious at this point that being a Ranger meant something to him, and I'm sure being named the captain was a huge moment in Jacob Trouba's career as well as his life. And clearly he didn't want to go anywhere. I mean, if he did, he would have just agreed to this trade or that trade over the summer. He wants to be here. But again, this is part of the business. This is part of professional sports. And this is part of what you sign up for if you're going to be a professional athlete, being paid several $1 million a season to play a game for a living. And I'm not trying to trivialize, anything that Jacob Trouba is going through, anything that his family is going through right now. I'm sure this is not an easy time for him or his family. But this Trouba situation, I said the same thing over the summer when it looked like they were going to trade him then. It's not in any way unique from other professional athletes. Again, it's unfortunate, but it's part of the business. It is what it is. And again, it feels like this is something that basically just had to happen. Jacob Trouba seemingly never got over what happened this summer. He admitted as much, and we're going to talk about some of the things that Trouba had to say after this trade went through a little bit earlier here today. We're going to do all that in just a second. Also going to shift our attention to what I think was the worst part of this Jacob Trouba saga, the worst aspect of it. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That is FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, we're going to go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. Huge shout out to the everydayers as always, and huge shout out to anybody that might be checking out Locked On New York Rangers for the first time. Obviously, there's like I said, 2 completely separate bombshells in one day: the Trouba trade, the Igor Shesterkin extension, the latter of which we will discuss in our next episode, likely dropping at some point tomorrow. We shall see. We're also going to talk about Urho Vakanainen. That is the defenseman that the Rangers received in exchange for Jacob Trouba. A young defenseman, still just 25 years old, former first-round draft pick. Doesn't seem like he's lived up to the hype as of yet, but certainly there's at least a little bit of intrigue there. Also going to be breaking down Rangers versus Penguins, whatever happens in that game. And, we will eventually do an episode where we circle back to Jacob Trouba and send him off proper. Again, I've been critical of Jacob Trouba on here. I've made no bones about the fact that I think his play has been unacceptable, but there have been some really nice moments with Jacob Trouba as a member of the Rangers, many of which he was the captain for. So we'll talk about that. A couple of clutch moments here and there. There was at least one Gordie Howe hat trick in there. The sort of kind of guarantee that the Rangers would beat the Canes in Game 6. So there was some cool stuff for Jacob Trouba as well. But like I said, I just can't justify, honestly, having this guy on the roster anymore. He's just too much of a liability every single time that he's on the ice. One other thing that I want to mention here before we move on to what I consider to be the worst aspect of everything that's gone down between the Rangers and Jacob Trouba. One kind of programming note here, whatever you want to call it. There was a little bit of a mix-up this morning. I was texted by my work associate that Jacob Trouba had been waived, and I was kind of in a tight spot at that time. They wanted me to submit a 1-minute video, so I did that, saying that Jacob Trouba had been waived. Obviously, Jacob Trouba had not been waived, so I apologize for that. I will not make that same mistake twice. That is a promise going forward. So again, my apologies on that. Shifting back to Jacob Trouba, though, and what I consider to be, once again, the worst aspect of this entire situation. And honestly, when I found out that Jacob Trouba was going to be an ex-Ranger by the end of this day, whether that was by being waived or whether that was by being traded, one of the first thoughts that I had was this should have happened a long time ago. This should have happened in the summer. This would have been a lot more beneficial for the New York Rangers if they had pushed through and traded him during the offseason. Because if they would have been able to move him at that time, then they would have been able to spend that money, that newly created cap space, to acquire free agents. And there were some hurdles there. We're going to go over those real quick here. And I do understand that. For starters, something that's been very well documented, Jacob Trouba coming into this season did have, and I suppose still does have, a limited no trade clause where he can block a trade to any of 15 different teams. That's his right to use that any way that he wants to use it, and I've got no issue if he chooses to do so. My understanding also is that Trouba's list of teams that he would put on his no trade list, the final decision or whatever you want to call it, that list was due basically right before free agency started. I think it was like maybe a day and a half before free agency started. And my understanding is that, and again, there were a ton of reports back then, but my understanding is that Trouba basically waited until the 0 hour to submit his list to the Rangers, presumably to make it as difficult as possible to trade him, and presumably to list teams that he felt like it would be likely that the Rangers would trade him to. And it sounds like that's exactly what happened. Again, there was that idea that maybe, maybe he'd be going to the Detroit Red Wings and maybe he put them on his list. We'll never know for sure now, unless it comes out that Detroit was or was not on his list. But even with that being the case, there was still time there between Jacob Trouba's no trade list being due and the start of NHL free agency that I think there was enough time for the Rangers to push through and make a move and trade Jacob Trouba. Because if the Rangers would have pulled that off, this offseason would have looked just enormously different and probably a hell of a lot better for this New York Ranger team. And here's why. First of all, think about the situation that the Rangers were in this offseason. Okay, so good season last year. Didn't get the ultimate prize. Bottom line, only one team out of 32 teams in the AHL is happy at the end of the season, and that's, of course, the team that lifts the Stanley Cup. And it was disappointing to see the Rangers lose in 6 games to the Panthers in the conference final. But it was, they were a successful team last season. You have them posting the best record in the NHL. You have them making it to the Eastern Conference final. You have them pushing the Panthers. All those games were close. That they all pretty much came right down to the wire. We had a bunch of overtime games mixed in there as well. So you're coming off of an enormously successful season, 2 wins shy of making it to the Stanley Cup final and a President's Trophy to boot. So, and you can even take the Rangers out of the equation here. You look at any team that fits the description of what I just said there, that team, whether it's the Rangers or anybody else, you might be just 1 or 2 moves away from really pushing this thing over the top, from really becoming the biggest dog in the yard and really becoming, arguably the Stanley Cup favorite heading into the next season. Again, that long run in the playoffs last year went down to the wire with the Panthers in an absolute dogfight. I know that, some people will fight me on that, but the bottom line, all those games were close. I really do think that series could have gone either way. You're right there. You're that close, 6 wins away from lifting the Stanley Cup. you are 1 or 2 moves away from maybe really pushing this thing over the top. And if the Rangers traded Trouba, not to mention waiving Barclay Goodrow, which also opened up some cap space, man, that would have opened up. I mean, I'm getting mad thinking about this because that would have opened up just an entire universe of possibilities for what the Rangers could have done in free agency. We went through, last offseason, we always do this. We take a look. Okay, who are some free agents that the Rangers could go after? Who are some of the big names? Who are some of the smaller names? Everything in between. Who would be a fit for this team? Who could maybe help them get to that next level? But because the Rangers did not pull the trigger on a trade of Jacob Trouba in the offseason, that meant that they were very much handcuffed and very much limited in whatever they could do, going forward into free agency. And as a result of that, what happens? Well, what happens is Sam Carrick is your biggest free agent signing. And nothing against Carrick. I mean, he's a fourth-line center. I think he's done okay in that role this season. Probably a couple too many penalties for my liking, but overall he's been fine. And the other big move that the Rangers did, and this wasn't free agency, this was a trade, but they go out and they deal for Riley Smith. They had to give 2 draft picks to the Penguins, and Riley Smith not long ago was a healthy scratch for a game. Might have been longer than that if Brett Berard didn't get injured. We'll never know for sure, but I don't think it's really clicked for him either. He's got 3 goals thus far in his tenure as a New York Ranger. So those are your big moves, Sam Carrick and Riley Smith. And I don't think either one of them is really moving the needle all that much. And Riley Smith is getting scratched. I mean, it was just the one time, but he was indeed a healthy scratch. And again, if Jacob Trouba is out of the picture, you can go after pretty much anybody that you want. A couple of names that I floated going into free agency were Tyler Toffoli and Tyler Bertuzzi. They were 2 of my favorites, but realistically, the only way that could happen is if the Rangers could clear some cap space, and the way to do that was to trade Jacob Trouba. So once free agency began, it was kind of a weird day for myself, and I'm sure for a lot of you guys as well, because we're waiting for the news on that Jacob Trouba trade, and it just never happened. And once free agency begins, it's a sprint. All these guys are signing with this team, with that team. They fly off the boards like nobody's business. A couple of guys linger a little bit, but you get that initial wave there where all the big names are signing with a team and they're off the board and there's nothing you can do. And then it got to the point where it's like, well, there's no point in trading Trouba now because, yeah, you'll open up some cap space, but now there's nothing to do with that cap space. And that kind of is the same thing right now. Now, of course, you trade Trouba, there's no salary retention. So you do open up $8 million in cap space. And apparently, I saw this earlier today, I believe the number at the trade deadline, now that Trouba is gone and they've got $8 million plus in cap space, that will accrue to $27 million at the trade deadline. So the Rangers can pretty much do anything they want at that time. So yes, you could still retool this roster. There could be some new moves coming. There could be some guys being run out of town. We'll see how it goes. But anything you do, if you're the Rangers now, if you're going to trade for this guy or trade for that guy, you now have to give up a second-round draft pick to bring in this guy. You now have to give up a solid prospect to bring in that guy, or maybe one of each to bring in a superstar player. Whereas in the offseason, had you pushed through with this Jacob Trouba trade and just said, screw it, we're going to do this, we're trading Jacob Trouba, then you could have gone into free agency with a whole different game plan and probably come away with, 1 or 2, pretty impactful players. And obviously that just never happened. So my big question to kind of wrap up this whole section here is, what changed? Like, why now do it? You needed to see more of Jacob Trouba. He's been here for like half a decade, And if you were going to trade Jacob Trouba just 24 games into this current season, then why not just do it in the offseason when this could have benefited this team immensely? Again, you're this close to winning the Stanley Cup last season. 1 or 2 moves maybe puts you over the hump. They don't do it. They hang on to Jacob Trouba, but then they just trade him anyway. 24 games into the next season. Great job. So that's the thing I think that gets my blood boiling about this more than anything. I mean, I know some people are upset about, there's Trouba fans that are upset that it happened at all. There's people that are upset about what Jacob Trouba has said after this has all gone down. And people saying that he never should have been the captain in the first place. And I mean, we'll see. But I did want to actually read one Jacob Trouba quote here before we move on to kind of wrap up this episode. And this is something that got people talking for sure. He was asked if the summer rumors of him being traded affected his play. And this is what he had to say about it. Yeah, it was pretty open with players on the team, with the leadership group. I mean, leading was a little bit harder for me in that situation. Knowing things that were public, if they weren't public and other guys didn't know, I think that would have been a little bit of an easier situation for me. Things unfolded how they did. It was tough at times for sure. Again, I will repeat something I said earlier. I do feel for Jacob Trouba to a certain extent, but at a certain point, you got to get over it. You got to get back to playing hockey. Throw in Drury's face. Come out and play the best hockey that you've ever played as a member of the New York Rangers. And if nothing else, continue to be a big-time leader for this team. The latter part of it, I can't say for sure. The former part of it, yeah, Jacob Trouba didn't play the best hockey of his career. I think we can say that without much hesitation, for sure. So in just a second, I'm going to shift our attention to kind of a bigger picture thing. What happens next for this team in both the short term as well as the long term now that Jacob Trouba is officially an ex-New York Ranger. And we will get to that in just a second. All right, let's go keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. So, all this talk of Jacob Trouba moving on from the Rangers is out there earlier today, and we know that something's going to happen, and eventually the trade is indeed struck. And one of the first questions that I had, okay, Jacob Trouba, the captain's no longer there. Which player in this New York Ranger locker room is calling the team meeting today? That's something else that kind of bothers me about this whole losing streak that they're on. I mean, losing 6 out of 7 games is not fun in any sport at any level. We know that. But one of the things that's kind of been bothering me during this whole dry spell, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that the Rangers look so lifeless, look so listless out there. Where is the players only meeting? I talked about this. I tweeted about this, a couple of nights ago, and I kind of quirked that that sounds like the job for somebody with a letter on his sweater, and kind of looking at Jacob Trouba a little bit. And obviously that never happened. I mean, we don't know for sure that it never happened, but usually whenever there's a players only meeting in any sport, it's because the team isn't doing well. And that news usually gets out to the media. I think typically when players do a players only meeting, they want people to know about it. Now, they're not going to get into the details about what is said in the players only meeting. That's why it's a players only meeting. But I think that they generally, the players, want the media and the fans to know, okay, we had this players only meeting, because at least it shows that there's some accountability, that they care, that they're kind of pumping each other up and getting off their chest, whatever they have to get off their chest. And okay, let's go. Let's pick things up. We're better than this. We never heard anything about a players only meeting for the New York Rangers during this awful stretch that they've been going through here. And obviously, Jacob Trouba is the captain, so the onus should probably be on him. Now Jacob Trouba is out of the picture. There is no captain, at least not yet. And more on that in a second as well. But now who steps up? Who's the guy? Who's going to lead the way for this team? Who's calling that players only meeting before this game against the Penguins or the day after? Something. Maybe you let the dust settle a little bit from everything that happened here today. But who's getting everybody in the same room and airing things out and, having a little bit of a rah-rah speech as well? I mean, one of the first players I think of is Chris Kreider, because he is the longest tenured member of the New York Rangers. He's actually, he's only 33, but he is one of the older players on this team. To me, he's the guy that should probably step up. We saw him have that kind of fiery rant to the media a couple of days ago, dropping F-bombs left and right. That's not really like Chris Kreider. To me, Kreider is probably the guy. You look at the other guys who wear letters. Mika Zibanejad, I'm not really holding my breath on him doing that. I can't say for sure. Maybe he would do something like that. I don't know. Just going by his demeanor lately, though, I'm not holding my breath. Panarin, there's a little bit of a language barrier there, but I think his words would carry some weight just because he is such a phenomenal player. And, he said before the playoffs last year, he went on record and said, we have to win the Stanley Cup. That was the mission statement. I'm sure that, he's doing that for some purpose, getting his teammates to feed off of that a little bit. I think Panarin people would listen to him. And I'll throw out one more name here. What about Jonathan Quick? A little unconventional, right? To have the backup goalie stand up and be the big rah-rah guy. But Jonathan Quick is not your typical ordinary backup goalie. This guy's a legend, 3-time Stanley Cup champion, going to the Hall of Fame. There's no doubt about it. And by all accounts, somebody that has been a very positive influence in that locker room. So I think maybe him standing up before this game and saying something, I think that would have carried a lot of weight as well. Hopefully we find out. Hopefully we get some idea of what's going on behind the scenes and how these players are dealing with everything. A couple of them were interviewed earlier today. But somebody's got to step up and somebody's got to speak up and somebody's got to take the reins here and be the leader of this team. Not one of the leaders, no, the leader of this team. Somebody has to step up and take on that role going forward. Whether they're officially the captain or not, somebody has to step into that role for the New York Rangers. As far as like another short-term thing here, well, we know that Victor Mancini has been called up The smart money is on him certainly being in the lineup against the Penguins. I think that will certainly be the case. I will say I'm glad that Mancini got some NHL experience earlier this season. He now has played 10 games. 9 of them were all very early in the season. He got sent down. He was back up for one game, the 6-2 loss against the Oilers. It's probably not an easy situation for Mancini right now anyway. Now, none of these players should be holding anything against Victor Mancini. Even if they're best friends with Jacob Trouba and they don't like the way this is handled, if they have half a brain, they should not blame the kid that's getting called up in Trouba's place. But I do think for Mancini, this has to be a challenging situation because we're talking about 21, 22-year-old rookie, whatever Mancini is, and he's being called up to replace the captain of the New York Rangers. So that's not easy, but I do like the fact that he at least got some NHL experience earlier this season, because if he was making his NHL debut, this would be a very, very difficult situation, I think, for Mancini. It probably is challenging in its own right even now, but I'm glad that he at least, got to know the guys a little bit, got to play in some NHL games, and I think held his own out there. And that's another thing, too. Going from Trouba to Victor Mancini, I mean, Mancini's just getting started, but it feels like an upgrade to me. There's going to be some hiccups along the way. There have already been some hiccups, but I think overall, Mancini, when he's been up with the Rangers, has mostly done a solid job, and hopefully he can build on that going forward. As far as like who the next Ranger captain is going to be, we're going to do a whole separate episode on that, probably as soon as next week, where I'm going to state the case for everybody that could conceivably wear the C next for this team. For now, I'll just say I would think probably Trocheck might be the front runner, and Lafreniere maybe is in second place. Those would probably be my two picks going forward. And again, I'll elaborate on that in an episode where we discuss this at great lengths. So we'll see how it goes. But the other prediction that I'll make right now, I don't think the Rangers name a captain for the rest of the season. It just doesn't really feel necessary. If they do, they're at least gonna, take a little while to do so. Because if you just name a captain tomorrow, it kind of feels like an unnecessary middle finger at Jacob Trouba. I don't think there's any real reason to do that. Like I said, though, somebody, whether they're officially the captain or not, got to step up in that role going forward for this New York Ranger team. Somebody's got to take control of this ship and steer it back to calmer waters. I don't know where I came up with that, but that's what we'll end on for today. Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in. If you'd like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, @LO_NY_Rangers. Once again, that's @LO_NY_Rangers. And definitely subscribe to Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.